Good morning and welcome to Dragonblood, attacking the Dragonfly Handshake of WPA3 in Laguna GHI. Our speaker this morning is Mathy Vanhoef. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Don't forget to stop by the business hall that's located in Mandalay Bay, Oceanside, and Shoreline ballrooms on level 2. The welcome reception is tonight at 5:30 in those rooms. The Black Hat Arsenal is in the business hall on level 2, and don't forget that tonight is the Pawnee Awards, and those are in Laguna JKL, which is just next door. Don't forget to silence your phones, and with that, I'll turn it over to Mathy. Thanks.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I am Mathy Vanhoef. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at New York University, and together with Eyal Ronen, we researched the security of the Dragonfly Handshake. And this is a very relevant topic because just last year, the Dragonfly Handshake has been adopted by WPA3 as the new handshake for this protocol. Now, before Dragonfly was adopted by WPA3, it was also already in use by the EAP-PWD protocol. Now, for those of you that don't know what the EAP-PWD protocol is, basically it's an authentication protocol that is used in relatively small amount of enterprise Wi-Fi networks where you authenticate using a username on packet. So in this talk, I'm going to present the research that we did on this handshake and several vulnerabilities that we found against it. Now, first and for all, a quick introduction about what the Dragonfly Handshake is. So the Dragonfly Handshake is something that we call a password authenticated key exchange, or in other words, a PAKE. And what does that mean? Well, first and for all, the obvious thing, it means that authentication is performed based on a shared password between, for example, a client and a server or a client on an access point. And in the case of Dragonfly, this handshake provides mutual authentication, which is what you would expect. The client has to prove that it knows the password, and on the other hand, the access point also has to prove that it knows the password as well. In other words, that you're not connecting to a rogue access point. And like most handshakes, Dragonfly Handshake also negotiates a fresh session key, and this session key is used after the handshake to encrypt data frames and to protect your normal data traffic. Now, the interesting property of the Dragonfly Handshake is that it also tries to defend against dictionary attacks and that it provides forward secrecy. And this is a big advantage compared to WPA2 because, for example, with WPA2, an attacker can passively capture the handshake that someone makes. He or she can then take that handshake offline and perform offline dictionary attacks against the password of the network. But the idea with Dragonfly Handshake is that this is impossible, that dictionary attacks will no longer be possible either by passive or active attacks. On top of that, the Dragonfly Handshake is also designed to provide forward secrecy, meaning if I capture your network traffic today, and if a year later I learn your password of the network, I cannot do anything with that. I cannot go back in time and decrypt traffic that I captured a year or more ago. Now, one other property that certain PAKE handshakes provide is that they protect against server compromise, but unfortunately the Dragonfly Handshake doesn't have that property. So what does that mean in practice? In practice, that means that if someone can compromise your access point or your router, the attacker is able to, for example, read the memory of the device and get the password from the device. In contrast, some other PAKEs allow you to store the password in a salted way that makes that a lot harder. Now, before we're going to go into the details of this handshake, let me give a very high-level description how it works. And let's assume that we have a client here, a smartphone, that wants to connect to the access point. Then, before the Dragonfly Handshake can be executed, both peers must convert the password, which is commonly stored just in plain ASCII, to a so-called group element, which we call P here. Now, why does this have to be done? Well, the idea is that this group element P is, for example, a large number which can then be used in the cryptographic operations of Dragonfly. So that's the first thing that needs to happen. And once that is done, the handshake essentially consists of two main phases. The first phase is the commit phase, and summarized, this is used to negotiate the session key that the handshake provides. And the second phase is the confirm phase, and as the name implies, this is used to confirm that both peers negotiated the same session key, and this also proves that they indeed possess the shared password. Now, the most interesting part of this handshake is how the ASCII password is converted into this group element P, because this is also where most of the vulnerabilities we discussed lie. And before we get to this, there's one important remark, and that is that this handshake, the Dragonfly handshake, can be executed using two so-called cryptographic groups. It can be executed using mod P groups and using elliptic curves. Now, you may not all know what these cryptographic groups are, so let me give a very short introduction to what mod P groups are. Basically, when you're using mod P groups, it means all your crypto operations happens using normal numbers. And this number has to be smaller than an agreed upon prime. And for all numbers in this cryptographic group, the equation you see here in the second bullet point, this one has to hold. Now, fortunately, this math will not be important, but it is good to briefly introduce this. And if you're wondering why are they called mod P groups, well, this is because all operations happen modulo the prime of the group. So let's get back to our original problem here. Before the handshake can be executed, the plaintext ASCII password has to be converted into an element of this cryptographic group. And the question is, how can that be done? Well, a naive way is to simply take a hash of the password, here denoted by PW, combine that with the MAC addresses of the client on the access point, and then use the output of the hash function, which is here called value, is then interpreted as a number. We then perform some kind of special computation. You don't need to know the details here, but basically this transforms the hash output into a valid member of this cryptographic group. And the idea is that the result of this formula can then be used in our cryptographic operations. Now, this is all nice and well, but unfortunately there is one problem with this. Namely, for certain mod P groups, there's a high chance that the hash output of this algorithm, when interpreted as a number, is bigger than the prime of this cryptographic group that is being used. And to simplify the explanation, if this value is bigger than the prime, then essentially this formula doesn't work to convert the number into a valid member of the group. So how did the designers of Dragonfly decide to tackle that? Well, they added a condition here where they're going to check, okay, is this value larger than the prime? Then we need to do something. And what do they do? Well, they decided to include a counter in the hash value, and in case in the first try this hash output was too big, they're simply going to increase the counter and try again. And if it's still not the case, they will again increase the counter and try again. So maybe some of you will already see the problem with this algorithm. The problem is that the number of iterations that are being executed here depends on the password. In other words, we have a side channel leak, and I will show how this can be abused to recover the password. What makes the story even more interesting is that the designers were actually warned about this. When this Dragonfly handshake was proposed already back in 2010, both the IETF and the CFRG, which are basically two mailing lists where people discuss new protocols, they warned that this handshake might be susceptible to timing attacks and other side channel attacks. So how come that this algorithm now still managed to find its way into WPA3? Well, at the time the reply was, I'm not sure how important this problem is. I don't think the designers thought that this wasn't a very practical attack, and there was also some doubt about whether it really leaked the shared password. In other words, yeah, there might be some information that is leaked, but can you really recover the password based on this alone? So let me now explain how you can indeed use this to recover the password. Let's say that we have a Wi-Fi access point, it supports WPA3, and it uses the algorithm that I just explained. Then, as an attacker, what I can try to do is I can try to connect to it, and I can measure how long it takes for the access point to reply, and based on that time, I can derive how many iterations the access point needed to convert the password into a member of the crypto group. And here, in this example, it takes the access point 2 iterations to transform the password. Now, how can I use this to, for example, perform a dictionary attack? Well, let's say I have 3 passwords as possible candidates. Then I can, as an attacker, run this algorithm offline on my own laptop and measure how many iterations it would take if I use a certain password. And in my example here, password 1 would take 1 iteration, and the other 2 passwords would take 2 iterations. And from this information, I can deduce that password 1 isn't being used by the access point because that doesn't match our observations. However, a lot of other passwords are still possible. For example, here we don't know whether password 2 or 3 is being used. So is there a way that we can get more information? And it turns out that there is, because if we look at the algorithm again, we can see that the MAC addresses of the client and the access point, they also influence how many iterations are executed. So what can we do as an attacker? Well, as an attacker, I can spoof another MAC address as a client, and I can again measure how many iterations the access point needs to execute. And then I can spoof another MAC address and again measure how many iterations that the access point needs. So let's go back to our example. Let's say as an attacker, we now use MAC address B, and we measure that the access point needs 1 iteration to convert the password into a member of the crypto group. As an attacker, we can again simulate on our own computer how many iterations are needed for candidate passwords. And here, for example, password 2 would need 2 iterations, while password 3 would need 1 iteration. And this means we can conclude that password 2 is not in use, and we can continue this approach with more MAC addresses until we uniquely determined the password of the network, which here in our example is password 3. So now the question that you may have is, okay, this is possible, but how many MAC addresses do I need to spoof and do I need to measure in order to, for example, perform a dictionary attack using a large dictionary? Well, it turns out you need very few measurements to do this. For example, let's say you take the RockU password dump as a reference. In that case, you need to spoof around 17 MAC addresses to be able to uniquely determine the password, at least if it is in the RockU database dump. So that isn't too much. The main takeaway message here, the main thing to remember is that this number of iterations that the access point needs to convert the password into a group element, this essentially forms a signature of the password. And this signature can then be used to perform an offline dictionary or even a brute force attack. Now, a final thing that I haven't explained here yet is whether it's really possible to measure how many iterations that the access point executes. I mean, is this possible to do over Wi-Fi? Because with Wi-Fi, there can be a lot of overhead, messages can be dropped or delayed, so is this feasible? And to test this, we took a Raspberry Pi 1, and on this Raspberry Pi 1, we used the open source host APD software to set up a WPA3 access point. Now, this open source software is also used in nearly all home routers and in a lot of professional access points as well. And the reason we picked a Raspberry Pi is because its CPU matches the CPU of ordinary home routers and even some professional access points. And it turns out that if we then measure how long it takes for the access point to reply, we can indeed recover how many iterations the algorithm needed. And in our specific setup, we needed to perform around 75 timing measurements per MAC address to recover how many iterations that the access point executed. Now, one remark here is that if the access point would use a much better or higher-end CPU, then you would need a lot more of these timing measurements to perform your attacks. However, because WPA3 is mainly designed to run on home routers, and home routers don't always have the fastest CPU, my guess is that at least for quite some devices, this could have been possible in practice as well. So it's now time to go back to the beginning of the presentation where, if you still remember, I mentioned that the handshake can be executed using two types of cryptographic groups. The first one is the one that we just discussed, namely the mod P groups, but the other one is elliptic curves. And the question now is, do we have the same kind of side channels if I decide to use Dragonfly using elliptic curves? And before I can answer that question, let me give a very brief introduction on elliptic curves. Basically, when we're using elliptic curve cryptography, all the crypto operations are performed based on points on the elliptic curve. And the point here is basically an x and y coordinate, where the x and y must again be smaller than the prime, and the formula that you see here at the bottom, it must also hold. Fortunately, we again don't need to know all the mathematical details here. What we do need to know is how the password is now converted into a point on the elliptic curve. So how did they decide to do this? Well, they took a very similar approach as in the mod P case. So what happens here is we take a hash of the password, we combine it with the MAC addresses of the client and the access point, and we take the output of this hash function as the x coordinate of our point. And then what the algorithm does, it will try to find the corresponding y value by essentially filling in this x value in the formula here in the middle, and then seeing if there is a solution for the y variable. Now, actually for half of all x values, there is no solution for y. So there is no corresponding y solution. And intuitively, you can think of this because we have to take the square root of this formula you see there at the bottom, and this square root doesn't always exist. And this is a problem, because that means that for certain hash outputs, there's no corresponding y values. And how do we handle this? Well, we handle this in a very similar way as before. We simply include a counter in the hash, and if it happens that we end up with an x value that has no solution for the y value, we simply increase the counter by 1 and try again. So you can see here that we are again having the same issue, because the number of iterations that are executed here depend on the password as well. And if we look at the EAP PWD protocol, which, recall, already used the Dragonfly Handshake several years ago, and this protocol is used in a small amount of enterprise Wi-Fi networks, then the specification of the ePWD protocol provides no defenses against this. In other words, it's vulnerable to almost exactly the same timing side channel that we just discussed. For WPA3, the situation is better. When they were standardizing WPA3, they realized that, okay, there is indeed a timing leak here, and we have to defend against this. And they decided on the following solution. They decided to always execute 40 iterations, no matter when the password element P was found. And this prevents most timing attacks, because if the password here is found in iteration 10, well, then still 40 iterations are, 30 extra iterations are executed, so we always execute 40 iterations in total. This means that if we at least use NIST curves, then there is no timing leak for WPA3 in this case. Unfortunately, though, there's also some bad news. The bad news is that WPA3 was also designed to support brain pool elliptic curves. And the problem with brain pool curves is that when using these curves, there's again a high chance that the output of the hash is larger than the prime being used by the scriptor group. And this would again mean that the remaining cryptographic calculations, they would not be valid. It's a simplified explanation, but we can use this here. This means that we must again see if the X output here is bigger than the prime, and we again need to solve this somehow. So maybe you can already see where this is going. Designers decided to add an if condition here, where if X is bigger than the prime, then we simply immediately go to the next iteration. So can you see the problem with this algorithm here? The problem is that this code here is now not always executed. And more important than that, the number of times that this code is not executed depends on the password being used. Now, this is a bit of a simplified explanation, but the main idea here is still valid. And the main idea of the attack here against this algorithm is that by, again, measuring the execution time for several MAC addresses forms a signature of the password. And we can then use this signature to perform dictionary attacks offline. So that covers all our timing attacks. Another type of attack that we can perform against this algorithm are cache attacks. And what do I mean specifically with cache attacks? What I mean is that an attacker can try to observe which statements in this algorithm here are being executed. In particular, what an attacker can do is that he or she can use the flush and reload technique to detect when this highlighted line here is being executed. And this again reveals information about the password that essentially forms a signature of the password. There is one important remark here when performing this attack, and this is that this code is executed 40 times because there are 40 iterations. So we also need to know in which iteration this condition was true. And to handle that, we use flush and reload also on the calculation of this hash function, and we use this to know in which iteration we are. And we can then know in which iteration the square root indeed existed. Apart from this, we can also monitor when the X value was larger than the prime. We can again use flush and reload, and we again also use flush and reload to detect in which iteration we are. So the takeaway message here is that cache attacks using the flush and reload technique, they're also possible against the Dragonfly Handshake of WPA3. There are some important remarks regarding this attack though, and this is that this cache attack requires a more powerful adversary because the adversary needs to be able to run unprivileged code on the machine of the victim. This can, in practice, for example, be a malicious Android applications with very few permissions, or researchers also showed in the past that against old browsers, it's also possible to perform these cache attacks from JavaScript. Although with updated browsers, they have mitigations against that. And the second condition is that, like most Wi-Fi attacks, the adversary also needs to be within range of the victim. So these conditions are quite high, so this is not the most practical attack. However, considering that WPA3 is a new protocol, it is quite surprising that implementations are vulnerable to this kind of attack. And as I mentioned, the information that is leaked using these cache attacks, it again forms a signature of the password, which we can then use in offline brute force and dictionary attacks. And by this point, you may now realize that both for the timing attack and the cache attack, the side channel leaks that occur, they basically can be used to obtain a signature of the password. So for both our timing attack and cache attack, what we as an adversary gain is a signature of the password, and we can then use this signature in a dictionary attack. This means that there will be quite some benefit to optimizing this offline dictionary attack and make it as fast as possible, because we can use it in both situations. And we implemented these optimizations on a GPU, and when running our algorithm on Amazon EC2 instances, we found that we can brute force 10 to the power 10 passwords for only $1 in Amazon Spot instances. Now, to give you a bit of an intuition about how large this dictionary is, basically, this is larger than all known password leaks. So this number is larger than the RockU database dump. It's larger than all the passwords in Have I Been Pwned. It's larger than all dictionaries of English words. So if you have a dictionary, it will basically cost you $1 to then brute force the password. At least if the implementation is vulnerable to the timing leaks or the cache attacks. And this is quite cheap. Inspired by this, we also made the calculation, what if we don't just want to perform a dictionary attack, but what if we want to perform a real brute force attack, and we want to brute force all passwords of 8 characters. And here I really mean all characters, meaning all 256 possibilities for each character. And in this case, when attacking ModP or brainpool curves, that would cost you about $70 on Amazon Spot instances. When you would apply this against NIST elliptic curves, the computations are more costly, and it would cost $14,000. And this is a lot more, especially if you would compare it to the dictionary attacks of WPA2. On the other hand, there is still the same remark that WPA3 is a modern cryptographic protocol, and this should not be possible at all. So that covers the design flaws that we discovered in Dragonfly. On top of that, we also looked at recent implementations of WPA3 and ePWD as well. And here we also found some implementation bugs. So the bugs that I discovered previously, they're really design issues that, in my opinion, should be fixed by updating the standard, but we also found some programming mistakes. And the most important one that we found, this was especially present in ePWD implementation, is the so-called invalid curve attack. And to give a high-level explanation of this attack, recall that the Dragonfly Handshake, in the case of WPA3 or also ePWD, the first phase of this handshake is the commit phase. And when using elliptic curves, this commit frame contains a point on the elliptic curve being used. Normally, these x and y coordinates, they must adhere to this specific formula of the elliptic curve being used. But as an attacker, we can try to send 2 x and y coordinates that are not on this elliptic curve. And if the implementation, in this case the access point, forgets to check whether the received x and y coordinate are indeed on the curve, this means that the negotiated key will be predictable. So to recap that, if we send an invalid x and y coordinate, the key that is being calculated by the access point is predictable. It can, for example, only have 3 or 100 possible values. And if the access point doesn't realize that, it will simply continue with the handshake, and we as an attacker can then guess the session key, and based on this guess, we can complete the second phase of the handshake, and we can then successfully authenticate to the network without knowing the password. In other words, this would bypass authentication, and to our surprise, all EPWD protocols that we looked at were vulnerable to this attack. Fortunately for WPA3, the situation in this case is a lot better because the Wi-Fi Alliance, in their certification process, they check that implementations properly handle this case. But even with this, we still found that the Linux IWD client, which is a recently developed Wi-Fi client, is vulnerable to a variation of this attack. Another implementation aspect that we looked at is whether implementations use a proper source of randomness. The reason why this is important is because if, for example, a client or an access point uses a predictable source of randomness, then based on the exchanged messages that the handshakes that the Dragonfly performs, we can recover the password element P. So in other words, if the random numbers are predictable, we can recover the password and we can then connect as the client. And here we found that in an old EPWD implementation of Aruba, this was the case. The random numbers were roughly predictable because they were generated based on the system time. And in this case, the password element P could be recovered. And this is actually quite an interesting attack because if we compare this to WPA2, then with WPA2, we would not have this issue. If with WPA2, we would use predictable randomness, at worst, we might be able to perform some more efficient dictionary attack, or maybe we can perform a key reinstallation. But in general, it doesn't have a much impact with WPA2, while with WPA3, if you use bad randomness, the result is absolutely catastrophic because an adversary can recover the password. And for now, there are not that many WPA3 implementations yet, but here my prediction is that maybe on IoT devices which don't have a proper source of randomness, this might be an issue in the future. Who knows? The last implementation-specific bug that we looked at is side channels that aren't design issues, but that we still encountered in some implementations. And the one that we found here is again against the EPWD protocol. And what we found there is that in the case of free radius, they implemented the extra defense of executing extra iterations to try to prevent timing leaks. However, even though they implemented this countermeasure, they still made a mistake here, because what they did is that if more than 10 iterations are needed, they simply abort the handshake. And in about 1 out of every 2,000 handshakes that are being performed, we indeed need more than 10 iterations, meaning the handshake will be aborted. And as a client, we can detect this. As an attacker, we can detect when the handshake is aborted. And the information that is leaked in that case, again, allows us to recover the password. Now, one other observation you may now be making is that in the EPWD implementations, we noticed quite some vulnerabilities. It was vulnerable to our invalid curve attack. We found sources of bad randomness. We now have this implementation-specific side channel. With WPA3, the situation is a bit better. And my guess is because vendors invest a bit more time in implementing WPA3, at least so far. So that covers the implementation-specific attacks. The last type of attacks that I want to discuss are more specific to Wi-Fi networks and WPA3 specifically. So if we go back to our initial overview of how the handshake worked, recall that if we perform the handshake, the password has to be converted into a group element, and this has to be done every single time the handshake is executed. We cannot store this group element offline, and this is because it depends on the MAC addresses of the devices, and in particular, it depends on the MAC address of the client. So an access point cannot simply store the group element P, because we as an attacker can then simply spoof another client MAC address, and the access point then must perform this calculation again. Now, unfortunately, as you saw here, when the access point converts this password into a group element, it implements this defense against timing leaks, meaning it executes 40 iterations every time a handshake is being initiated. And that is quite a large overhead in practice. And especially when you use one of the more secure and bigger elliptic curve groups, this overhead is quite high. For example, we found that against a professional access point that supports one of these bigger elliptic curves, if I would initiate, say, 10 handshakes per second, this would overload the CPU of the access point. And if I would use a smaller elliptic curve, but still one that is secure, this would be around 70 connections attempts per second. And if I do that, then the CPU of the access point would be overloaded, which in practice would mean that other WPA3 handshakes would be delayed or would no longer be possible. In other words, as a client or as an adversary, we can initiate these handshakes with the access point and cause a denial of service attack. Another Wi-Fi specific attack that we found is that WPA3 also supports a mode where a network can simultaneously support both WPA2 and WPA3 at the same time. And the decision that they made here is that both the WPA2 and the WPA3 network, they would use the same password. Now, if we were to try to attack this setup, for example, let's say that I find an access point that supports both 2 and 3, then I could try to set up a malicious access point that only supports WPA2, and I can then try to establish a man-in-the-middle position. However, that won't immediately allow you to attack the handshake, because if as an attacker you are trying to force a victim into executing the WPA2 handshake, then the WPA2 handshake will detect that the real access point supports WPA3, meaning the victim will detect, hey, there's an attack going on and I'm going to abort the handshake. And that's good, because that means that WPA3, when you configure it this way, where you simultaneously support both versions, then it provides forward secrecy. Unfortunately, there's one small problem here, and it's actually a big problem, namely this partial WPA2 handshake that is being executed, that already provides enough information to do a dictionary attack against it. So even though the client may detect that the real access point supports WPA3, by the time it finds that out, it's already too late, because the exchanged messages so far allow you to perform a dictionary attack. So how can we prevent this? Well, what we can do is we can let the client remember whether an access point previously supported WPA3. And if so, then we will only connect using WPA3 in the future. And this prevents this downgrade attack. And this is similar to the trust on first usage of SSH or HTTPS pinning. And the good news is that the Google Pixel 3 and the network manager of Linux they implemented this defense, meaning if you use that, you are secure against this attack. A second kind of downgrade attack is also possible, and this downgrade attack is against the Dragonfly Handshake itself. So recall that the Dragonfly Handshake can be performed using multiple cryptographic groups, and some of these groups are relatively weak, while other cryptographic groups are relatively strong. It turns out that we can influence which cryptographic group a victim will use. In particular, the way that a client on an access point, for example, negotiate which cryptographic group is being used is that the initiator of the handshake will suggest a cryptographic group that the device wants to use, and then the responder either accepts that group or it rejects it. Now, it turns out that spoofing this reject message is trivial, meaning we can simply, as an adversary, spoof the reject message and then force the victim into using a weaker cryptographic group as it would otherwise use. And this is a design flaw in the handshake of Dragonfly, and clients and access points are vulnerable to this attack. So as the last part of this presentation, I want to briefly go over the disclosure process that we followed and the mitigations that are being implemented. So what we did here is we tried to notify parties very early with as hope that we could influence WPA3. Now, during our initial disclosure, there was actually some skepticism regarding our attacks because they mainly considered this to be implementation flaws. They thought, oh, the timing leak, we can prevent this by executing extra iterations. On the cache attack, we can also prevent this by very carefully implementing it. And one interesting remark is that one developer even said, yeah, we actually knew about one of these downgrade attacks, we just forgot to warn you about it. Now, the official reaction of the Wi-Fi Alliance was that they privately created guidelines to securely implement WPA3. Unfortunately, in these guidelines, they mentioned that brain pool curves are safe to use, but as we discussed, even when using brain pool curves, some vulnerabilities, some side channels remain, and this actually meant we had to do a second small disclosure. Now, there is one fundamental issue that remains, though, that even if we implement these backwards compatible countermeasures, there's one big problem with the design of Dragonfly. And this is that it has to perform 40 iterations in order to defend against our timing leaks. And that's a very costly thing to do, especially on lightweight devices. Executing these 40 iterations is too costly. And the problem is even worse here because you might now think that, yeah, but if I have a powerful smartphone or if I have a powerful laptop, then this doesn't matter. The CPU of my device is powerful enough that this isn't an issue. Unfortunately, what we see in practice, or what's at least a common practice with WPA2, is that a lot of times the Wi-Fi handshake is offloaded to the Wi-Fi radio itself, so that the main CPU doesn't have to care about the handshake. And unfortunately, these lightweight Wi-Fi chips, they are not powerful enough to always execute these 40 iterations. Meaning, as an implementer, you have to decide between either doing these 40 iterations and possibly being vulnerable to denial of service attacks or consuming a lot of power, or not doing these iterations and possibly being vulnerable to timing attacks. So that's not a good situation because no matter what you do, you basically end up in a bad position. The good news here, though, is that the standard is now being updated with ways to prevent these vulnerabilities in a proper way. The first thing that is being done is that they are now implementing a defense to prevent these downgrade attacks against the cryptographic groups. And another design issue that they are now making is that they modified the algorithm that converts the password into a group element so that this algorithm can also at least partly be executed offline. This means it doesn't have to be executed every single time you perform a handshake, and this helps with allowing you to implement it efficiently and also makes it more complicated to perform attacks. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but some other defenses that they are now discussing to implement is to implement this algorithm that converts the password in a constant time fashion for both the mod-p groups and the elliptic curve groups to really prevent these side channel leaks in the specification itself. And these suggestions are actually very good. So if an implementation follows these, WPA3 is actually, in my opinion, a pretty good protocol. Unfortunately, these changes are not backwards compatible. So this might lead to a new revision of WPA3. It's still unclear how this will be handled. So there might be also a risk of downgrade attacks against the initial version of WPA3. It's unclear what will happen here. Now, the final thing I want to say here is this research mean that it's now very trivial to attack WPA3? Well, the answer is no. WPA3 is still better than WPA2. Because with WPA2, it's really trivial to perform a dictionary attack. You just capture the handshake and you do your dictionary attacks. With WPA3, you need to perform these timing attacks, you need to perform these cache attacks, and only then can you do the dictionary attacks. So in that sense, WPA3 is better. However, as a modern security protocol, the vulnerabilities that we found are really unacceptable. So that concludes my talk. So the takeaway messages here is that WPA3 is vulnerable to side channels. The countermeasures here, they are quite costly. And because of that, the standard is now being updated. And the planned updates, they're actually quite strong. So the last conclusion here is that if you have a device that supports WPA3, yes, WPA3 has its flaws, but it's still better. So if possible, you should use it. So thank you for your attention, and if there are questions, feel free to ask.